Welcome back to the Volunteer Matters podcast. It's Mark and Sophia.
Hmm.
All right, so today we're talking about orientation versus training. And I know sometimes the lines get blurred between the two, so we're going to make that distinction for you and dive into each type. Um, so, yeah, let's get
Yeah.
started.
Yeah. Sometimes when somebody says an orientation and I ask them what's on the agenda for the orientation, it sounds an awful lot like a training to me. Other times I hear somebody say they're going to be doing a training and it sounds a lot more like an orientation to me. So sometimes just the naming of things is important to make a distinction. And there are clear differences, in my mind anyway, between the two. So let's just jump into it. Let's define, at least to Volunteer Matters, what a volunteer orientation is. So I sort of have two different takes on it, or two different, I guess they're two different types of orientations. One I would call like a global orientation. That is to the volunteer program, to the organization, so that there's some baseline of understanding and relationship between the volunteer and the organization. Then the second type of orientation would be more event-based, like the volunteer or volunteers showed up and we need to do a stand-up and orientating them for the day kind of thing. So one is a more general orientation and posture in the relationship. The other one is more tactical. So on the global one might be, we have a lot of organizations that actually require volunteers to come to an orientation before they can do anything else. They say, listen, we hold these on the first Tuesday of every month. We would like you to come and we'll have a conversation, a dialogue, then we'll figure out where you best fit. That's a little bit older of a model for volunteers. There's a higher barrier to engagement for that. You have to actually have people physically show up and attend the orientation before you would then go ahead and place them. And I say that's older only because that's the model that a lot of organizations followed for decades. And a lot of them have moved away from that just because the shift in the people's lifestyles and things of that nature. But sometimes that's the best way to go about it. So I'm not disparaging that approach. It's just an older model that works for some organizations, but maybe not the majority of them. But in that kind of orientation, it's like a, hey, let us get to know each other. Let us tell you about the organization, our mission, how we utilize volunteers, how you can make an impact here, what types of volunteer roles there are, what our expectations would be of you, what benefits you might get out of it. And then usually after that is when there's some sort of negotiation as to how the volunteer will participate with the organization. Usually it does precede them volunteering for the first time. Sometimes maybe not. Sometimes we have some groups, right, Sophia, that they say, well, you can sign up to volunteer, but you have to go through the orientation within the first 30 days of working with us and things like that. So it really is it's the learning about, it's more about the relationship, that type of orientation, and seeing if we're a good fit, right? And then we have the other type, which is more event and tactical based. So maybe, Sophia, you can give a stab at sort of explaining how that might work.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times when you think of orientation, it's like, oh, you come in for a day, for a few hours, and we have some sort of get together and talk about the organization. But sometimes right before an event, you have volunteers show up and you've never actually met them, and which is totally fine. But before the event, you want to orient them to the day. So giving them the schedule, maybe that does include light training. Like, this is how you run the water station at your 5K.
Right.
And yeah, and then it definitely doesn't take as long as the other type of global organization orientation, I would
Yeah,
say.
and we might orientate them, even if they were a returning volunteer, we might give them a little mini stand up at the start of it anyway.
True.
So it's more like I have a group. It's a group of corporate employees that are volunteering at our organization, and when they arrive, we just do a little stand up. And it is rather than, there still is some elements to the global orientation where you introduce them to the organization, what value and benefit, what your mission is, how they're helping today. But then also the who, what, when, why, where aspects of the day. Like, what's the agenda? What are the expectations? Who can you go to if you need help? There might be a little mini training, like Sophia said, like, this is actually what you're doing today. Like, you're at a food bank and we're preparing, bags of food that we can hand out. And you're going to put one of these and three of those and five of those in a bag, and you're going to move it on to the next person. Right. And there's also the opportunity to thank our volunteers, set any expectations for the day, but then also afterwards, like, hey, we're going to be sending you out a thank you or asking for your feedback. So please give us a rating. And, there may be things like that. So it still is this idea of relationship building and setting expectations so that sort of volunteers know what they're getting themselves into. Then they have a sense of confidence moving forward. Actually, both sides have a set of confidence moving forward, right? So then we also were talking about the difference between that and training. So with training, I put that into two major categories. The first category is you cannot or should not do this job until you've been properly trained to do the job. So there is sort of this safety, risk, liability, compliance aspect to this. So, Sophia, what's a good example of type of volunteer work that always requires training with our customers?
Child abuse prevention training,
Yeah,
mandated
anybody
reporter
working with
training.
kids, right? What else?
Yeah. Like if how to handle animals if you're working on an animal shelter. So maybe like working a retail store, a thrift store.
Yep. Yeah, so
Um,
it's like you have to know you cannot do this job until you've had this information presented to you, and you've also demonstrated enough competence in it that we feel comfortable, both sides feel comfortable that you actually can do this job. So like I said, in orientation, it might be a mini training, right? Like, so like how many food items to go into the basket is technically a training, but the way that we would look at that is much more of an orientation. If this is a skill where there needs to be time allotted and dedicated to learning how to do this job, otherwise there are going to be issues, it's definitely a training. And that's the focus of it, right? The focus of an orientation is to get everybody started on the right foot. Whereas a training is kind of like, no, you need to know this stuff before you get started. So the one
yeah.
example is like a compliance or risk side of it. The other side might actually just be an enrichment side of things. So like Sophia mentioned, if people are working with kids, child abuse prevention trainings, mandated reporter trainings, if you're working in a youth sports capacity, concussion protocol trainings, if you're working in a thrift shop, you might have to take a sexual harassment training, like depending on what your policies are. On the enrichment side of things, or even just talk about competence. So let's say that you're a museum and you have volunteers that are actually docents. I might require that you have a training. Like my wife used to be a docent at the Mark Twain House in Connecticut. She would walk around the house and yeah, talk about all about the history of the house and of Mark Twain. And so there were all these trainings that she had to go through before she was allowed to do that training. So that to do that tour. So those would be more on the compliance end of things. Like we want to make sure that you're competent enough to give the tour and answer random questions about Mark Twain's life and his family and the house and the artwork that hangs on the walls. Like there was so much that she had to know. And then there's an enrichment side of it. So once I meet the minimum requirements to be able to do this, there's also some benefit to the volunteer to be more well-rounded. So if I offered a training to volunteers who did a youth sports program, maybe one of the trainings I offer in the benefits of sports being introduced to children with disabilities. And it's actually to learn about what impact it has on those kids. And they don't necessarily need it to be a youth sports coach, but it would be a great training for them to have. Or to use the museum example, maybe to use the Mark Twain example, maybe there are things about Mark Twain's life, like Harriet Beecher Stowe lived next door to Mark Twain, and we have a training all on Harriet Beecher Stowe, and they don't need that in order to do that tour. But boy, wouldn't that be great? And the people that are there are typically history buffs that love this sort of stuff. So to offer this enrichment training, not only does it make their job as a docent even better, but it also brings something to the volunteer from an enrichment perspective. So these are all things that we should be thinking about, like how do we orientate our volunteers so that they know like where all the pulleys and levers are, that they're connected to the mission of the organization. Tactically, how do we know that they know what they need to do for the day, on the orientation side of things. Then when they're, the things that they must demonstrate some sort of mastery in order to be able to do that job or understanding of for a compliance-based training, or what kind of training do we want to offer just to enrich their experience, generally speaking. And the other thing that on the training side of things would be like, how do we deliver these things? So on the orientation too. So Again, sort of the old model would be, yeah, you show up someplace and there's somebody there who's doing the orientation, leading the orientation, or there's some person physically there that's doing a training. And then the people who are receiving these show up to someplace physically, and they're either with a group or sometimes it's one-on-one, right? So, um, and that doesn't always necessarily fit in with people's lives the best way possible or in your staff's schedule. So, for example, if we had to deliver every training to every volunteer in a one-on-one setting between one volunteer and one staff person, it requires a lot of staff time, especially if you have a volunteer program of scale, at scale. So if we have one volunteer, not that big a deal. Probably do want to do it one-on-one if you only have one volunteer.
Yeah.
But if you have hundreds or thousands, that's a little bit different. So maybe, Sophia, you can talk a little bit about pros and cons between live in person versus virtual.
Yeah, well, this is you might need to have a training in person.
Very true.
And wait, did you say which one which two? Like a course versus a
I didn't.
like a live? Oh, okay, so that's
Yeah,
another
yeah,
thing too.
yeah.
So in person, let me go back to that. Sometimes you need to actually work with equipment. So like maybe you need to learn how to use the cashier device at the thrift store. So that would be a pro to having it in person. It's kind of more tough to put that into a course or have that online. And then it's helpful to the volunteer to be able to take the training whenever it fits into their schedule. So maybe they're like a busy student or mother or something like that. They could just do a course instead of having to be present at a specific time. So I think that definitely lowers a barrier to engagement if they can do it on their own schedule.
Yeah, those people that have been around us a lot, we talk about lowering barriers to engagement. So we always say it's like there's a fishing metaphor, like you got to volunteer a tug on the line and you want to make sure you reel them in. So we don't want to make this next big step some huge problem for them in order to get started. So whenever we can push things to be virtual, online, an online course, a recorded video, even a webinar, even if it's a live webinar, but it's something they can do from home or from their phone or sitting on their couch or from work or wherever they happen to be in the world, is better than asking them to drive to some place and receive an in-person training. And then there's also a hybrid approach. And Sophia touched on this, but sometimes doing it in person is the best way. So I want to put that out there. So if you're training somebody how to use a cash register, or if you're that animal rescue organization, you're teaching people how to handle animals, you can't do that behind their desk with a camera like we're doing now. But you might be able to do some of that stuff. So sometimes we'll have people say, well, we normally have this 3-hour training that we do, and it's all done in person. And we're an animal rescue organization, and 30 minutes of that is actually handling the animals. The rest of it is like, is general information about the organization, the mission, the hours of operation, policies, procedures, expectations, dress codes, stuff like that. And they might, in those cases, we're always trying to find ways that we can move some of that to be virtual and save the things that can only be done in person to be done in person. And the reason for that is usually the in-person stuff is the fun stuff or the stuff that causes the most anxiety for people. So if the rest of the stuff is actually pretty easy, like we can handle that with an online course, and volunteers really appreciate that. So I might be able to do a 2-hour online course, and then I show up and there's a 1-hour in-person training, and they can get the 2-hour, online stuff done in advance. And it actually makes them better equipped and more prepared for the training once they do it live. So we're always trying to find ways which we can make this easier on everyone, because if we can get all of our training done virtually, that's awesome, right? So they can do that on their own time according to their own schedule, and it doesn't require a staff person to lead the training for them. So that's the ultimate, if it's the best way to do it. After that, any sort of hybrid where we can utilize technology in the best way possible, and allow people to do the majority, a decent percentage of that training virtually, again, on their own time, and then leave only the really fun stuff or the only really critical stuff to do in person. So we've had customers take, a 2-hour training and where they wanted to do some relationship building, some tactical hands-on, and then some stuff that's just general training. And they've turned that instead into a 90-minute online course and a half an hour get together. And the get together is like all the fun stuff and totally all about relationship building. And we've seen great results come out of that. So that could be the case for your orientation. And it can also be the case for your trainings. And the last part I'll say is that there's no 100% right answer for everybody. There's definitely pros and cons to both of these. So if you're sitting there listening to us thinking, oh, I could never move that to virtual, you're probably right. If you're thinking to yourself, oh, geez, that would be really helpful if we could move that to virtual, then you're probably right too. It's just recognizing that these two options exist and that it may feel like a big burden to move to virtual than it actually is, because we have customers do it all the time. In fact, during COVID, this was probably the number one reason that we were getting people to sign up with us throughout COVID, is that they were trying to find ways in which we didn't have to have groups of people together in a room getting trained. And so they were like, you know what? We actually could move all of this virtual. And so things for generations that were being handled by in-person trainings, people in large numbers were just moving to virtual trainings and never looked back, and it worked out beautifully. Any thought? I always talk too much, Sophie. You have to interrupt me and give yourself more time here. Well,
well, I was thinking of, we mentioned one litmus test, like if you think making a training online would relieve some of your duties, then like go ahead and do that. That probably is the right decision. But if it seems like impossible, then keep it in person, like go with your gut in that sense. But I think also a litmus test to decide if something's an orientation or training is, in my experience, a training, you have to evaluate the performance or like knowledge of the volunteer in some way. So like they usually get a certificate from a third party, or they take a quiz, whether you created the quiz or it's a quiz from a third party. You have to pass the quiz. And I think that might be a good way to say, is this an orientation or training? Because usually you don't have to pass anything. You don't have to pass an orientation. I mean, you have to be a good person, probably. You can't be like super mean.
I love that you just pointed that out, because it's always great to have a rule to say, how should I treat this? And you have to demonstrate mastery. When you're trained for something, you have to be able to demonstrate that you learned something. And so in a training too, there's usually some feedback that says, yes, I actually learned something, and here's a certificate to prove it. So usually, like in any of our online courses, there are tests, there are quizzes along the way to demonstrate that they've actually retained and understood the materials. I love those sorts of things, those litmus tests. So very good. All right, did we crush that?
Did it all? I think we crushed it.
I think we did. We talked very fast on this one, though. I hope everybody got it. But if I talk too fast, you can always slow it down in the playback, I guess. But don't play this one at double speed.
Well, the other thing is we have another episode. I don't know the number, but we could always link to it, about different types of training. It's all about training.
Oh, good. Yeah. Did we do that one already? Or we have that one on the docket? We did? Okay, good. Yeah. See? I'm glad you're keeping track.
We'll link it below.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.